Hey guys, TW Woodward and Jeff Eckerly here with the Generation Built for the Storm podcast. I'm going to give a brief introduction to us again. This is a new podcast, and I just kind of want to set the stage for who we are and why we're doing this. We're both parents. We both have kids that are kind of in today, which is January of 2026. Kind of in that 19 to 22 age range, which is it's a very interesting generation, especially given the times that we're in. Jeff and I are both tech forward, tech focused. We work on startup companies in the software world. We each have kind of our own expertise. We go in a little bit different directions. Jeff is very much on the team leadership side of things and running the businesses, whereas I come in more as on the technical side of things. We're going to try and share some of our different perspectives on things. For a more detailed introduction on both Jeff and myself, you can refer to, we have an introductory episode. We did a little bit more introductions of ourselves and who we are and what we do, but also we did a longer introduction to the project itself and what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to entertain. We're not trying to be political. We're here to spark curiosity. And I think exploration into some topics that are near and dear to our hearts. I will say we've just, together, we've kind of, Jeff and I have shared this path forward, just trying to understand a little bit better the times and the things that are going on. And we're hopeful that we can get some conversations going with that kind of age group, right? Because it's such a critical time in your lives. And we're just hoping we can help with a little bit of advice and perspective on what's happening in the world. It might feel a little crazy right now. I know it certainly does to me. But we also have done enough research and study that we think that this is kind of a normal thing that's going on. There's cycles out there in history that are starting to repeat itself and merge, and we just want to be prepared for this time and what's next, especially this next generation of leaders that are going to take up the mantle to make the United States a better place, a more successful place, and you certainly are in line for that role, and we're hoping we can help prepare. I'm going to actually today turn it over to Jeff a little bit more. He's going to take over and share some slides and dive a little bit deeper into some of the research that we've done, which has led to kind of the conclusions that we have around these cycles and what's happening in the world today.
Awesome. Well, thanks, TW. I think where I'm going to start is, for me, thinking back to high school is a long time ago. For you, the crowd we're aiming this at, pretty recent, right? But I think that there's a lot of things that as my adult life has taught me things that about history that I think, man, history class or high school economics would have been a lot more interesting if they would have gone into some of the topics that we're here to talk about. And I think that's really a good starting point to think about this project in general, is the way that history repeats itself and how monetary policy by governments impact history and the patterns that we see. That's kind of the big picture here that's going to lead to hopefully an aha moment for you at the end of this episode that really gets you excited and interesting about learning more about the opportunities ahead. But in the vein of history, you think about how this country was formed. Really, the United States was a startup. I mean, no one talks about the American Revolution as a startup, but having, TW and I have both worked inside of startup software companies, and when you start something from scratch, you really don't know what direction it's going to go. Most other countries were started by, a king or some sort of territory that was taken over by another territory, and it's very different. And I think that that's part of the entrepreneurial spirit that the United States has really been built from, and that's at the foundation of some of these patterns we'll talk about. But TW, before I jump into a couple slides, any comments on what you remember from high school history and economics that,
You're asking me to go back a little ways,
yeah.
but why don't you fire up the slideshow? My take on it is similar. It's interesting because it was, like Jeff said, the first time really in history that some very smart people, they're certainly revered in the United States, got together to really think this through. How can we make this better? They were frustrated with the way government worked. That's like way understating. Right? Like, they were very frustrated with the way things worked. And so they built this crazy system, the Constitution. They built this system that set out the rules, for how, to Jeff's point, the startup government was going to work, right? And what's really interesting about it is it kind of went viral, right, Jeff? Like the rest of the world at some point kind of took note, and a lot of the Western Hemisphere kind of followed suit to this new model that was built, which is a testament to how smart they were and how well they built the model, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I throw these 4 books up here, and I want to remind you, if you listen to the original introduction, TW and I are not historians. We're not experts. We are people that have consumed a lot of books and podcasts and follow newsletters, and we are people that connect dots. So everything that we're sharing with you here is intended to be like things that we've uncovered through connecting from different sources, something that we think is interesting. And I just highlight 4 of the key books that relate to this episode around these cycles that I'll get to in a second. But The Changing World Order talks about how empires and nations have been rising and falling throughout the history of time. Generations is a really interesting book that details out how every 20 years or so a new generation is named and a new cohort enters adulthood with similar experiences to each other. And there's this pattern of every 4th generation, or about every 80 years, this 4th turning concept, where we see significant change. And then The Storm Before the Calm is probably the book that kicked this whole project off, that really kind of is a great summary of a couple of these cycles that really ties a lot of the generations in American history together. And if you are inspired to read one of the many books that we have kind of built this foundation from, that's the one that I would start with. So what are these 3 cycles? I want to introduce them as a technology cycle that is running every 50 years, an institutional cycle that runs every 80 years, and then a debt cycle. And this one may take a little more in-depth understanding than what we ultimately go into, just because it gets into a lot about monetary policy that is, not new to, or is very new to people that haven't studied it in depth, but we'll try to explain it at a high level. And what we thought we'd do is just kind of go into each of these cycles in a little more detail here. Again, this is meant to keep things short. If you want to go deeper, read the short book that we've got on our website. But TW, any comments before I hop into this?
Nope. I personally think this is a great way to look at history, right? So it's a reframing, like Jeff said, where we've all had history classes in the past. These cycles are a very interesting way to look at history, and as Jeff said earlier, it's just not taught this way. So I'm excited. So let's do it.
Yeah. All right. So let's first focus on the 80-year institutional cycle. And institutions are think of them like the government or religion or higher education. It's these unwritten kind of rules, sometimes more written than others, that really guide societies to, ultimately being better off together. And what's been noted, and this is where the history we've talked about so far, and taking this back to the American Revolution, about every 80 years in the United States, we've basically reinvented our institutions. We've torn down what existed before and rebuilt a new type of institution. And so if you look at the 1780s, and we all know the Revolutionary War was in the 1770s, but the Constitution didn't actually get ratified until 1787. So it took about 10 years to figure out, oh, hey, we just won this war, we have our independence, but how are we going to govern ourselves? And so think of that as the starting point or the birthplace of the Republic, which at the time, the states were very, very, shall we say, skeptical that a new federal government wouldn't come in and just take over all the power, because each of the states that formed the United States was a very strong and almost independent body in their own.
That's important. That's important to note, Jeff. Like at that time in history, this is important because it's going to change throughout these steps. Is you might have been a Virginian first, right? I'm a Virginian, right? You're proud to be a Virginian, and then a citizen of the United States second, and it's United States plural, meaning like all of these states were a conglomerate, and they were very individual, and they had individual personalities.
Yeah, exactly. But that initial constitution framework of a decentralized federal government and very powerful states allowed the country to get off the ground and march forward for 80 years, or about, remember my comment about generations, 4 20-year blocks of generations. And what typically happens, the reason that that fourth turning book was so interesting is that a typical long living person, especially now compared to maybe in the 1780s, but 80 years is about as long as anybody lives to remember why the institutions were built in the first place. So by the 1860s, so 80 years after the Revolutionary War and the Constitution, you now have the North
Jeff,
and
you
South.
You froze up there a little bit. You froze up there. Can you rewind and just go back to, it was basically 80-year generation thing. Like at 80 years, you forget is where you left up. Okay.
Yeah, so at 80 years, once 80 years has passed, that's about the time period where whoever was around at the beginning of an institutional cycle or how institutions were built is no longer alive to remember why the institutions were built the way that they were. So institutions kind of wear out, and as time marches on, they need to be reinvented. So fast forward to the 1860s, 80 years after the Constitution, and now we have this situation where the northern states, now a lot of people I think are taught that slavery is the main reason for the Civil War that happened in the 1860s. But obviously it was one of the reasons, but another big reason is that the northern states were becoming more industrialized and were starting to manufacture and be more wealthy from different means than the southern states that were more agricultural and plantations and relied on slave labor. So that creates this challenge, right? And so how does the country work through that? And what happened was that a federal government got stronger. One side stepped in and won a war, and on the other side of that, the federal government picked up a lot of power and had to help rebuild the South after the North had defeated it. So that's kind of step one of the federal government getting more power, and new institutions were built. The government changed, and then another, 80 years later, following the Great Depression, and as World War II came about, the United States needed to kind of reinvent itself again. And everyone had to get on board fighting in the same direction with, defeating Europe and so forth and Japan and ultimately winning the World War II. And so that meant the federal government got even stronger and bigger, and new things, new institutions like Social Security were created in the 1940s to provide another level of prosperity and progress and so forth for what was perceived to be needed going forward in the 1940s. And now you fast forward to the 2020s, and the institutions that were built, how government was built to be is, now showing signs of being maybe too big or too inefficient. Our government today, our institution of government, and many institutions, whether it's your higher education or public school education, they were all built on frameworks before the digital age. Because when I say digital age, I'm talking about the internet coming about in the late 90s and so forth. So our institutions have to adapt, change, and likely reinvent themselves to now be what's needed for the next 80 years. And the theory of all this, when you read about generations and the fourth turning and the cycles that are put out in these books, is that part of what's happening in the 2020s here is that we're rebuilding, we're tearing down and rebuilding institutions, and we're living right through the middle of it. So, TW, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'm just going to summarize. This is crisis, right? And then solution. And then kind of a swing through some peacetime, right? And then to face the new challenge, right? There's this crisis that happens. And then, so if you look at revolution is the crisis, Constitution and that subsequent few generations gets to enjoy, right, that next 60, 70 years because kind of it's been level set, right? And the new set of rules are in place. Same thing with the Civil War, as Jeff mentioned. So you got crisis, Civil War, and then you get the solution and that kind of next 70 years, right? Until Jeff said the original generation that had to go through all the pain of the crisis is gone. They're dying off. And then collectively we forget how painful it was to go through that. And the system starts breaking down, wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah, and the important thing that I think, gives us both a lot of optimism is that every time we've gone through one of these rebuilds of institutions, the prosperity for everyone in the country has increased. So that's the promise for young people today, is that you're living through this crisis at this formative era, but you're going to have 50, 60 years, if this pattern holds, you're going to have 50, 60 years of great times at higher level prosperity, because this country, again, back to the point of being founded as a startup, just has that entrepreneurial drive to keep getting better, better, and better. We just got to go through some hard times to get there. And that's happened, multiple times in the past. So that's the 80-year institutional cycle. Now I'm going to touch on the long-term debt cycle. And this really is tied to how a country becomes a global superpower and then at some point doesn't become a global superpower. And this has happened over time as well. You can go all the way back to the Romans, the Roman Empire, thousands of years ago. The reason that they eventually fell was due to a failure of their currency, or the debt that the country ran up because it was in power eventually caught up with them. Same thing happened with Spain. When Christopher Columbus was running around the world and a lot of gold was being collected, they built a ton of wealth and ultimately got overextended. But at one time, they were the global superpower. Then France had it for a while, and the French Revolution fell in 1789. Great Britain became the power of the 1800s through industrialization of the world. But ultimately, as World War II came to a head, their debt caught up with them as well, and they no longer became the superpower. And so after World War II, the United States emerges as the global superpower. There's some really interesting maneuvers that were made related to oil and in the 1970s that furthered the US dollar's strength as the global currency that everyone around the globe depended on. And that created tremendous amount of prosperity for the United States. And this is where we could go deeper and deeper on this, and some of the book that we wrote does. But you have to understand a little bit about global economic patterns and what it means to have the global currency, the currency that the globe recognizes as the currency be yours. And that's the position the United States was in. And so this slide is talking about 1971. That's a very important date in this whole process, because that's when the United States went off the gold standard, meaning that the United States could just keep printing dollars, adding to the money supply, basically creating money that we could then spend, because the rest of the world was just buying our debt. And that's a pattern that has increased significantly through COVID. Another, between those 2-3 years during COVID, 40% of the money supply was increased. And ultimately, again, the book goes into a lot more detail on this, but you start to experience inflation. And as countries amass more and more debt, the only thing that they can actually do is inflate the currency, which ultimately hurts everybody that's holding currency. And again, I'm not going into the detail here, but this pattern that has been seen, from global superpowers rise and fall over time, is that it creates a gap in wealth between the haves and the have-nots, and ultimately, a government can't make good on the money they owe, and they can't pull back their spending, so they have to keep borrowing. And you reach a point where all that's left to do is debase the currency even more, which ultimately hurts the people that have the fewest assets. I'll leave it at that. We could go a lot more deeper on that. But the point is that the United States, since World War II, is now experiencing this transition from being the global reserve currency. Just in the last 10 years, and it's accelerating, other countries are stopping the process of buying our debt. They're buying gold. If you've looked at the price of gold over the last 10 years, how much it's raised, it's because other countries are starting to supply or back up their financial systems with gold instead of US dollars. And so we're on this downward shift of the United States being the global superpower. And it's not something that's just going to happen overnight, but it's a phase that we're going through, which causes more and more challenge for the government, as well as for potential conflicts around the world, as well as for the average consumer, who is wondering, why something today that cost $1 in 1971 now costs $8. So TW, I'll stop there. This is one of those topics we could go so deep, but I don't know if there's something I missed that you think is relevant for this level.
I got one thing, at least one thing. But so back to go to generationbuiltforthestorm.com and download this thing. We just call it the guide because we don't know what else to call it. It's basically we'll give you a little bit more in-depth resource and reading on what Jeff's talking about right now. It's hard to cover what that document talks about in a podcast. But the reason that in the 70s, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, so the dollar was no longer had to be backed by gold, the dollar fluctuated crazily and it was kind of out of control for a few years. And so what they did was, with an agreement with Saudi Arabia, who I think was the largest oil producer at that time, supplying most of the world, Nixon's administration cut a deal that meant that the entire world, if they wanted oil, had to buy it in US dollars. And I think that's really important to note, just to kind of tie together what Jeff was talking about, why the US dollar became this world currency and turned into inflation and debt, as this thing expanded over the course of the last 80 years, the last cycle, right?
Yeah. Good. That's and again, like we could do a whole episode on the petrodollar, and maybe we will at some point. But in the interest of time for this session, we said there's 3 cycles. We talked about the institutional cycle, which is an 80-year cycle. We talked about the long-term debt cycle, which kind of is the rise and fall of a global superpower. And now I want to just touch on the 50-year technology cycle. So if you go back to, again, let's go back to 1780 and think about the major technological evolutions that have happened throughout the history of the country. They seem to run in these 50-year patterns. And the 50-year cycle or pattern is tied to the amount of time it seems to take to squeeze all the productivity out of a given new technology. And then a new one is born. And each time this happens, there's, industries that drastically change. There's jobs that go away. And so we just have to understand that technology is driving change as well, which I will say is separate from the institutional changes we talked about. So let's just quickly review kind of since the Revolutionary War. The first major innovation was steam and railroads, steam engines and steam power and railroads. It used to take, I think the number is 4 months to get a letter from New York City to San Francisco in say 1800, because you'd have to sail all the way around South America and come up the other side. Well, in the 1830s, steam and railroads started to change how long it took to do things, or could collapse time and distance. It was almost like a time machine. By the time that the Transcontinental Railroad was built, I believe that got done in the 1860s, 1870s. I don't know the exact date, but then it took 7 days to get a letter from New York City to San Francisco, and they had telegraphs that could get information across the rail lines. So time and distance collapsed. Big innovation. Then in the 1880s, that was the start of electricity, and first light bulbs, but ultimately it allowed manufacturing plants to be powered, and so many inventions just came about once electricity was harnessed and people could start to turn it into productivity driving inventions. And so that went on for another 50 years. And then the next big thing was the internal combustion engine, which launched the automobile industry. And now again, back to creating this ability for mobility. Each individual could drive wherever they wanted, faster, they didn't have to walk. And it became possible for an average person to buy a car. 50 years later, in the 1970s, the microchip started to be the new technology that then enabled software, the internet, the digital revolution that we've kind of touched on. And now as we reach the 2020s, the productivity gains of just software and computers has started to dry up. We can't become any more productive with that technology. So now it's time for the next technology to come about. And I think a lot of you have been very exposed to AI and the promise of productivity that AI is starting to bring now in the 2020s. I think we'll talk more later about, we think it's the combination of AI and blockchain that ultimately is this new technology wave that we're calling the autonomy era. But we'll save that for more detail. The main point of this slide is to get your head around the fact that these major technology advancements have more or less been happening about every 50 years. And right now in the 2020s, we're in the middle of this shift into a new technology cycle. So TW, what do you have to add to that?
The only thing I'd add to that is it's interesting because was just thinking about this as I'm looking at this slide that we have up, and I'm not sure we're doing a good enough job of explaining kind of what's in these slides. We are doing this with video and with audio, so you can look at it on YouTube if you want to see this slide. But it was basically 1830s steam and rail, 1880s electricity and industry, 1920s auto and oil, 1970s microchip and software. 2020s is that last era that Jeff's talking about, this one that we're about to step into with AI and blockchain. The thing that's interesting is it weaves through this slide is there's a dominant energy source that leads to these technological revolutions. On the first two boxes that are on the slide, but what I just mentioned, steam and rail and electricity and industry were largely coal-based as far as that technology cycle. And then as it weaves up, you get into auto and oil. And as an extension of the oil industry, you get petrochemicals which creates the plastics industry, right, moving forward, which then leads into microchip and software, which starts now to blend electricity right into this new era where we're about to shift into what my opinion is the next dominant energy source that is required for AI and blockchain. Everybody's talking about right now is electricity. So we're starting to see electricity move into the forefront as the key. And electricity comes from multiple sources, so I don't want to understate that. It could be nuclear. I could go back to coal. I can't see it too much, but maybe we do. Or fossil fuels, right, to create the electricity. But the scale of electricity that we need moving forward is going to be interesting with this AI and blockchain revolution.
Or we need all sources of electricity in the future humming in unison for us to have a chance to meet the demand that's probably coming. Because that's going to be a constraint for this next technology era. So I'll start to wrap this up. Again, these are the three cycles we talked about: technology cycle, institutional cycle, debt cycle. And we've kind of started to foreshadow this, but I want to bring this all home to the original point that we talked about in the introduction, and why we did this is that you're becoming adults at a really crazy time. There seems to be issues wherever you look, right? A lot of chaos, whether it's political, there's division, there's it seems really challenging, I would imagine. And we're trying to help you understand this theory that these cycles in the 2020s are all overlapping. And never before has any of these cycles in the history of time overlapped. Just by the math of how 50 and 80 lines up over a 250-year period, these cycles have always been offset from each other. And now, as we look at the 2020s, the cycles are lining up exactly on top of each other. So smack dab in the middle of that is 2025. We're at the beginning of 2026 right now. So the theory is that everything that is happening around you that feels wrong or not right, or just like if you're feeling that there isn't a good future, take a step back, look at the history of all this, and understand that these cycles have been going on for 250 years, and you just happen to be living in the middle of them all lining up together. And what I said before that I think is really, really important, every single time one of these cycles has reset, standard of living, prosperity for the average person has taken a leap forward. And I don't see any reason why this time, this kind of reset, if you want to call it, that we're living through, isn't going to have the same opportunity and outcome on the other side. In fact, it might even have more, because all three of these things are converging at once. So, I don't know if I want to go as strong as to call the 2020s the demolition phase, but it's really the reinvention, the rebuilding, and whatever happens in the coming years, it's probably going to be hard. We're right in the middle of this. But what I want you thinking about is, what does the reconstruction look like? Who's going to pick up the blueprints and set the course for the next 80-year institutional cycle that can take advantage of the next, the unfolding technology cycle. And then what does that mean to monetary policy? And who will the global superpowers become? Those are all things that your generation gets to decide. And ultimately, as we go through this material in the book and the stuff at the website, it's really trying to encourage you to be curious and think about this and think about the role you can have in reshaping the future.
Well said, Jeff. And again, that website is generationbuiltforthestorm.com. If this is interesting to you, go read that source document. So when you join us on the next podcast, you'll be up to speed. And our plan here and our great hope is that we're going to create some engaging conversation. And in the upcoming episodes, we have panel discussions with members of Gen Z. We want to hear from you to talk through this, because Jeff and I don't have all the answers. We're super curious about what's around the corner and how, here to help with questions, but also learn from you on your thoughts and where you're at and how this thing might unfold, right? How you can take advantage of it. So let's wrap up this one, Jeff, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
All right. Thanks, everybody.